Zohran Mamdani stood silent as Nancy Pelosi erupted on live TV. "No one can arrest Barack Obama," she screamed, her voice echoing across the chamber. But Mamdani had come prepared, with documents. Just one folder, just one word, and everything would change. Her longtime allies would scatter. The media would turn, and in minutes her storied career would begin to unravel. Stay until the end, because the word Mamdani uttered would silence the room, a word you'll hardly believe. But before we get to that, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe so you never miss the moments that shake Washington. Pelosi leaned into the podium, eyes fierce, voice trembling with outrage. "No one can arrest Barack Obama," she repeated. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Reporters exchanged glances. Phones lit up. Headlines were being written before her words had even faded. Across the room, Zohran Mamdani sat still, almost too still. He didn't blink, he just watched. Then a slow, calculated smile appeared. Not the usual friendly grin, but the kind that said, "You just stepped into my trap." What Pelosi didn't know was that Mamdani had been waiting for this very moment. Weeks, maybe months. She'd taken the bait, and now it was his move. But before we continue, remember, by the end of this video, you'll hear the single word that Mamdani said, the word that silenced the room, set social media ablaze, and shattered Nancy Pelosi's political armor. Stay tuned. Back in the chamber, Pelosi wasn't finished. She slammed her hand down. "This is a political witch hunt, a disgrace to our democracy. Barack Obama served this country with dignity, and I will not let you drag his name through the mud." Mamdani finally rose. "Are you finished?" he asked calmly. Pelosi narrowed her eyes. "Don't you dare." He lifted a hand. "Because if you're done, I'd like to begin." Just like that, the atmosphere shifted. Pelosi's fury still rang, but something colder filled the room. Mamdani reached for a folder beside him. A red tab peeked out from beneath a black binder. He opened it slowly. The silence was suffocating. Pelosi was used to dominating the conversation. She wasn't used to waiting or watching someone else seize control. Mamdani looked her in the eye, then at the whole chamber. "I came here to talk about corruption," he said, "but not the kind you expected." A nervous murmur fluttered through the room. Pelosi forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous. He's bluffing." But nobody joined her. Mamdani held up a document. "This is a wire transfer dated March 3rd, $287,000 from a lobbying group based in Nigeria, sent to an organization controlled by, you guessed it, Nancy Pelosi." Now there was no murmuring, only dead silence. Pelosi's face reddened, her smile faltering. "That's a lie," she said, waving it off. "That document is fake." Mamdani raised another page. "Here's your nephew's signature. He cashed the check, and there's more." Nancy Pelosi stepped back from the podium. Her usual fire dimmed, just a fraction, but it was enough for everyone to notice. She searched the room for support, but the faces around her had changed. Some stared at Mamdani, eyebrows knit in curiosity. Others avoided her gaze, suddenly unsure where they stood. One of her longtime allies, Congressman Ellis, leaned over and whispered, "Nancy, is any of this true?" She snapped back, "Of course not." But her voice cracked. Mamdani didn't stop. He was already turning to the second page. "This isn't just about money," Mamdani said, his voice calm but resolute. "This is about power, influence, about using elected office as a personal aid." He didn't need to shout. Each word struck with weight. Pelosi tried to cut in. "This is political theater." But Mamdani didn't even look her way. "These are your own staff's emails," he continued, waving a thick packet. "We traced the transactions through 3 shell companies. Same address, same accountant. Every single time, the money ended up in your family's accounts." The room gasped. This was no longer a press conference. It was an execution. In the back, the media scrambled for better angles. A reporter whispered, "We're witnessing a political takedown." Pelosi gripped the podium, desperate to regain control. "You think you can smear me and walk out of here with applause?" she shot back. "I have fought for justice for decades. You can't erase that with lies and forgeries." Mamdani finally met her gaze, the smile gone. "I don't need applause," he said softly. "The truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs daylight." One sentence, but it landed with the force of a train. A staffer from Pelosi's office abruptly stood up and left. The cameras caught it all. CNN cut to commercial, other channels stayed live, and Nancy Pelosi suddenly looked alone. Outside, the media frenzy grew. Breaking news banners ran across every screen. Mamdani accuses Pelosi of financial corruption. Inside, Pelosi clung to defiance as her last shield. "This is beneath the dignity of this chamber," she hissed. "You're weaponizing your power like a dictator." But Mamdani didn't flinch. "I'm not here to argue titles," he replied. "I'm here to ask the questions you refuse to answer." He flipped to another page. "A $60,000 consulting fee paid to your daughter's company 3 weeks after she met with foreign donors in New York. Would you care to explain that?" Pelosi didn't answer. Instead, a voice from the back, a fellow Democrat, spoke up. "Wait, what meeting?" The question lingered awkwardly in the air, longer than it should have. Pelosi turned, her eyes wide. "Don't start turning now. You know what this is? He's playing games." But the silence behind her said otherwise. Mamdani stepped forward, pressing his advantage. "Here's what's not a game. Federal law, and according to these bank records, you've been bending it for years." He paused, then delivered the line with icy clarity. "And I haven't even gotten to the overseas accounts yet." The room buzzed with whispers, panic, and glances exchanged in every corner. Pelosi tried to shout above the din, "This is harassment, political persecution." But the louder she got, the weaker she sounded. Mamdani stayed calm, almost serene, as if he knew this wasn't just a battle, but a slow collapse, a building crumbling from within, and the cracks were now impossible to ignore. A congresswoman slid her phone to a colleague. On the screen, a poll. Pelosi's approval rating had just dropped 7 points. Live. Aides' phones buzzed with calls. In her district, angry voicemails piled up. But Mamdani pressed on. He leaned in, speaking just loud enough for the mic to catch. "You said no one can arrest Obama." He paused. "But what happens when the one protecting him gets caught first?" By now, the room had completely changed. Democrats were silent. Republicans were somber. Everyone knew this moment mattered. Pelosi leaned in, gripping the microphone like it was the last solid ground beneath her feet. "I have spent decades fighting for justice, fighting for the people," Pelosi declared, her voice ringing out. Mamdani didn't interrupt. He let her speak, knowing something she didn't. With every second she spoke, more eyes were watching. Not with admiration, but with suspicion. One by one, her allies fell silent. They didn't shout, and they didn't walk out. They simply went quiet, which in Washington is worse than betrayal. It's abandonment. Mamdani turned another page. He didn't need to raise his voice. Even the soft sound of paper turning made Pelosi flinch. According to Treasury documents, when he said, "You received over $850,000 in donations from a network tied to foreign development firms that later secured government contracts." He let the numbers hang in the air. They were too specific to ignore. Pelosi staggered back, then forward, then back again, like a cornered fighter trying to steady herself. "I never approved a contract for anyone," she shouted. Mamdani lifted an eyebrow. "I didn't say you did, but your nephew did, and your niece handled the paperwork." This was no debate, it was a dissection. Outside, reporters shouted into cameras. Inside, no one dared speak, except for one. A young congressman from her own party rose, his voice soft but unwavering. "Speaker Pelosi, I think you need to step aside, at least for now." The room froze. Pelosi looked like she'd been struck. Her jaw clenched. Her voice came low. "You're falling for a con." Mamdani didn't look at her. He looked into the cameras. "America isn't falling for anything," he said. "They're finally waking up." The hearing broke for a brief recess. Pelosi vanished into a side room with her top aides. Cameras lost sight of her, but the whispers didn't stop. In the hallways, phones rang nonstop. Every news outlet was live. CNN had 4 analysts debating. Fox News called it the collapse of a career. Even MSNBC was asking hard questions. Inside the side room, Pelosi paced like a trapped animal. "They're turning on me," she muttered, her voice frantic. "All of them. I need someone to go on record. Now." An aide stepped forward hesitantly. "Ma'am, no one's returning our calls." She stopped cold. "What do you mean?" "No one wants to be quoted defending you. Not until this cools down." Pelosi's face hardened. "Cowards," she spat. "They'll regret this." But regret wouldn't help her now. Across the building, Mamdani sat quietly at a small table, a single unopened folder before him. His advisors didn't speak. They knew better. He was holding the final card. A reporter slipped into the hearing room, snapping a photo of the folder's label, Pelosi Foundation Internal Communications. By the time Pelosi returned, the internet was ablaze. Screenshots, leaks, and threads spreading faster than anyone could control. Mamdani stood as she entered. "Back so soon?" he asked, barely looking up. "I'm not going anywhere," Pelosi snapped. He nodded. "Neither is the truth." Then, without warning, he opened the final folder. "This," Mamdani said, raising a printed email chain, "is from your foundation's executive director." He highlighted a line. "We'll filter the funds through the education grant first. That way it's clean when it lands in her account." Silence. Not even the cameras clicked. Just silence. Pelosi stared at the document as if it might vanish if she glared hard enough. "I don't know what that is," she whispered. "You don't have to," Mamdani replied, calm as ever. "The authorities already do. The FBI already does." The impact wasn't just in the hearing room anymore. It was sweeping across the country. On cable news, anchors leaned in, reading excerpts from the leaked emails with raised eyebrows. On social media, the hashtag #PelosiExposed shot to #1. Clips from the hearing spread like wildfire. Her outburst, Mamdani's calm replies, the chilling moment he said, "The FBI already does." Even her loyal supporters started hesitating. "She's being framed," some tweeted. But the replies were unforgiving. Framed with her own emails. Funny how fake documents always match the money trail. Outside her district office in San Francisco, a protest had formed, and it wasn't angry partisans. These were her own voters. Their signs read, "We believed you, no more lies." Back in D.C., Mamdani leaned into the microphone again. He didn't need more evidence, just pressure. "The American people deserve answers," he said. "They deserve honesty, and they deserve leaders who serve them, not themselves." Pelosi slumped in her chair, not broken, but battered. "You don't care about the people," she muttered. "This is revenge." Mamdani didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his folder, then straight at her. "You brought this on yourself," he said. Suddenly, Pelosi stood. "Then let's talk about Obama," she snapped. "That's what you're really here for." A flicker of interest rippled through the room, but Mamdani just shook his head. "We'll get there," he replied, tapping the folder. "But first, we finish this." One of Pelosi's senior aides stood and left, then another. Reporters whispered, "She's bleeding staff." A member of the Oversight Committee leaned into a colleague. "She might not last the week." And still, Mamdani pressed on. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't gloating. He was simply watching her unravel, piece by piece. And everyone else was watching too. The committee chamber was no longer a battleground. It was a spotlight, and Nancy Pelosi stood alone in it. Even Democrats who once cheered her every word now kept their heads down, eyes glued to notes they weren't reading. Mamdani slowly closed the final folder and set it aside. He didn't need more paper. The damage was already done. Pelosi tried to speak, but her voice barely carried. "You're destroying everything just to protect yourself." Mamdani turned to her slowly. "Protect myself?" he said. "I walked in here with nothing but facts. You came in screaming, and now you're whispering." The room held its breath. Every journalist in the back typed as fast as they could. Then came the moment nobody saw coming. The oversight chair leaned forward, clearing his throat. "In light of today's evidence, the committee will be opening an official ethics inquiry into Speaker Nancy Pelosi." Pelosi froze. "I won't dignify that with a response." "You won't have to," the chair replied. "The documents will." A reporter shouted, "Do you plan to resign, Speaker Pelosi?" Another called out, Have you spoken to the White House about the foreign money allegations? Pelosi shielded her face, pushing past aides who now felt less like a team and more like strangers. Mamdani stood quietly, watching it all unfold. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The storm had arrived, and he was standing in the eye of it. Cameras swarmed Pelosi as she exited the chamber. She didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't look back. Inside, Mamdani remained at the podium, hands folded, waiting until the chaos subsided. Then he looked out at the committee, his voice steady. I said I'd bring the truth. I never said it would be pretty. By the next morning, headlines shifted from speculation to confirmation. Pelosi under ethics investigation. Staffers flee office after Mamdani bombshell. FBI quietly confirms documents in review. She didn't appear at her scheduled press conference. She didn't post on social media. For the first time in years, Nancy Pelosi went silent, but the noise around her only grew louder. Donors pulled their pledges. Endorsements disappeared. One by one, the foundations of her political machine crumbled. Back at the Capitol, reporters surrounded Mamdani as he exited a committee meeting. Assemblyman Mamdani, do you feel vindicated? He smiled gently. This was never about me. It's about accountability. Do you think she'll resign? Another pressed. He paused, letting every microphone lean closer. I think when the lights get bright enough, the shadows disappear. We'll see what's left. Cable panels exploded with speculation. Some accused Mamdani of orchestrating the whole confrontation for political gain. Others begrudgingly admitted the evidence was too strong to ignore. A leaked memo from a top Democratic strategist summed it up. We cannot defend the indefensible. Nancy must step aside before she brings the party down with her. Even in her own district, cracks became fault lines. Local newspapers ran blistering editorials. Constituents called for her removal. Volunteers quit her re-election campaign. Just like that, the woman who once thundered through Congress became a national liability. Mamdani, meanwhile, kept his distance. No tweets, no gloating. He let the story breathe. Because sometimes silence is louder than any statement. In Pelosi's silence, it was starting to sound like surrender. It happened midweek. A single line in a DOJ press release set Washington on fire. A formal inquiry into financial misconduct involving Speaker Nancy Pelosi is now underway. That was it. No dramatic announcement, no press conference, just a sentence. But it was enough. News anchors raced to report. Federal inquiry launched, Pelosi under legal scrutiny. Then came the real shock. One of her former staffers agreed to cooperate with investigators, voluntarily. He didn't go to the press. He went straight to the Department of Justice. Suddenly, this wasn't about documents. It was about sworn firsthand testimony. By Friday, Pelosi's legal team issued a terse statement. We categorically deny all allegations and will cooperate fully. But it was too little, too late. The narrative had shifted. The tide would not turn back. Public trust evaporated. Fundraising collapsed overnight. Political allies stopped answering her calls. On Capitol Hill, whispers grew louder. She's finished. Meanwhile, Mamdani attended a community forum in Brooklyn. A woman in the audience asked about the investigation. He didn't mention names, didn't even say Pelosi. He just smiled and said, "Funny how truth has a way of catching up." The crowd erupted. Even the media couldn't deny it. This wasn't just a victory for Mamdani. It was a turning point, a warning shot to every politician watching. If you have something to hide, the clock is ticking. Someone is always watching. And when the moment comes, sometimes all it takes is one word to bring it all crashing down. Monday morning, the Capitol was silent. No cameras, no chants, no chaos, just stillness. Because Nancy Pelosi had cleared out her office before sunrise. No resignation letter, no press conference, just a brief internal memo, effective immediately. I am taking an indefinite leave from all official duties. But the public already knew what that meant. The committee vote was set for the next day. The FBI was preparing subpoenas. The court of public opinion had already spoken. She was finished. Across the country, the reaction was divided. Some called it justice. Others called it political vengeance. Either way, the result was the same. Nancy Pelosi had vanished from the political stage, and Mamdani, calm and collected, walked into a press briefing later that afternoon. A reporter shouted, "What do you say to the people who think this was personal?" He didn't blink. He simply leaned in, adjusted the mic, and spoke one word: accountability. That was it. No long speech, no punchline, just one word. And somehow it echoed louder than anything else said that week. Because in the end, that word didn't just close a chapter. It opened a new one. A chapter where power doesn't come with protection, where no one is above the law, where even the loudest voices can be silenced by the truth. So when Nancy Pelosi had screamed, "No one can arrest Obama," she wasn't just defending a man. She was revealing her fear because deep down, she knew what Mamdani knew all along. If the truth ever got out, she'd be the first to fall, and fall she did.